Hello guys, what's up? It's Asif here again. So today, in this particular video, I am gonna differentiate the Sony Alpha 1 with the Sony A7R Mark IV, and it will be dedicated towards the landscape photographers. That if you are a landscape photographer, then you are on the market searching for a new camera, especially a Sony Alpha lineup of camera, then what you will buy, the Sony Alpha 1 or the Sony A7R Mark IV. Let's go and find it. Now, first of all, if you are a landscape photographer, what you actually need? First of all, a great high megapixel count, over 30 megapixel. If there is over 40 megapixel, 50 megapixel, that is good. At least a full frame sensor. If there are medium format sensor, then it will be better, but we will be strapped with the full frame sensor here because Sony does not provide or create any medium format sensor camera, so that is the highest we can go in that part. Autofocus speed, autofocus point does not offer a great deal, but on that particular camera we should have with the ceiling, and the price range will be in our capability. So let's go and find out. First of all, Sony A7R Mark IV has a 64 megapixel sensor, full frame of course, while the Sony Alpha 1 has a 50 megapixel sensor. On paper, the Sony A7R Mark IV has a little bit edge, not a little bit, maybe a great edge, because 14 megapixel is quite a big deal here, but you have to understand that you have to work with larger raw file if you are choosing the Sony A7R Mark IV than the Sony Alpha 1. But Sony Alpha 1 has a secret weapon here, because it is the first camera on the Alpha lineup which is giving us a sensor shift technology. So by that, the Sony Alpha 1 will change the position of the sensor little by little and can shoot 16 full 50 megapixel shot and then combine them to create a single raw file, and that will be with 199 megapixels. So that will be a great deal, but you should have a steady tripod to use that technique, and your subject should not be moving any 1 inch. You have to understand that. The Sony Alpha 1 has a newer sensor which called the Beyond XR, and on the Sony A7R Mark IV we are getting an older sensor Beyond X, which is still a capable sensor, but the Sony Alpha 1's sensor is at least twice fast than the old Sony A7R sensor, so you will get your work done in half of a minute than it take with the Sony A7R Mark IV. That can be a great deal, but in landscape photography I don't think so, because in landscape photography we just go on a location, wait for the right moment, wait for the right light, then just connect a wired remote and capture the shot. So speed does not mean all for landscape photography. It is actually a great deal on terms of wildlife and sports photography, but for landscape photography I don't think that it is a great of a deal, but it is a new camera, so it is just good actually. We have 567 autofocus point, phase detection autofocus point on the Sony A7R Mark IV, and on the Sony Alpha 1 we are having 759 autofocus point, also phase detection autofocus point. So 200 more autofocus point than the Sony A7R Mark IV. Is that a great deal? I don't think so, because if you are a wildlife photographer or a sports photographer, then 50 more autofocus point will be a great deal. But here we just use the LCD screen, So the autofocus point is not that of a great deal in landscape photography, and over 500 autofocus point is just more than enough we ever really need on terms of landscape photography especially. You have to understand that. Now I already said about the autofocus point, and the Sony A7R Mark IV actually giving us 10 fps of continuous shooting, and the Sony Alpha 1 is offering 30 fps of continuous shooting. But I think if you are a landscape photographer, then you should know that this is a piece of shit because you never use that functionality if we are a landscape photographer. So it's not a great deal, but it's still on the camera and I am making a comparison, so that's why I am saying it, guys. Sorry for that, but you have to hear it. Okay, on terms of ISO, they both performs same. They start from as low as 100 and go as high as 1,28,000. If you are using extended mode, then they will start from as low as 50, and that is great. And I don't think any landscape photographer will ever use over 64,000 of ISO. If you are a astrophotographer shoots a Milky Way galaxy, then only that particular case you will ever use higher ISO than 32,000 or even 64,000, but you will never use more than that. So more than that ISO is not a great deal, and on these terms both the camera have the same capability. Last, on the price point, the Sony A7R Mark IV has a price point of just $4,000. I am saying it's just because if you compare this with the Sony Alpha 1, the Sony Alpha 1 has a price point of $6,500. So the Sony A7R Mark IV is actually $2,500 cheaper than the Sony Alpha 1, and this will be a great deal in terms of money, because with that perfect money you can have a great lens. So why you should spend the extra $2,500 on the Sony Alpha 1? Yes, that makes sense, guys. Now there is another thing, but I'm not sure what it actually do, so I have to read from this paper. I write it down because I don't know actually. Okay, so it says that finally the Sony Alpha 1 has a better low light performance with minimum sensitivity of -4 EV, f2 aperture, and phase detection point can work at f22. The Sony A7R Mark IV has a sensitivity up to -3 EV, f2, and work up to f16. So it says that it has a better low light performance, but I don't think that we really need that, because as I know, as of my particular knowledge, it will be a great deal if you are a sports photographer or you shoot in studio or extreme night condition. But in landscape photography, I don't think that it will be a great deal. So if you have the knowledge that it will be a great deal in landscape photography, so let me know in the comment box below. I love to know that. So these are the main thing between these two particular cameras. Other than that, all of the things are same. They both have 2 card slot, great battery life, totally magnesium alloyed, weather shield body, Wi-Fi, NFC, Bluetooth inbuilt, and they both feature the same E-mount full frame sensor from the Sony. So as a conclusion, what would you pick between the Sony A7R Mark IV and the Sony Alpha 1 if you are a landscape photographer only? You have to understand that before going to the market and buy the camera. And remember, I never say about the videographic specification in those two cameras, because I am creating this comparison on terms of landscape photography, not videography. So what would you pick? For me, if you ask for a suggestion, I'll say that go with the Sony A7R Mark IV. and save the extra $2,500 and use that money to buy a lens. That will be a better option because you are getting 64 megapixel count instead of a 50 megapixel count. You have a 567 autofocus point, which is just great. The electronic viewfinder is greater in the Sony Alpha 1, but who needs that? Because landscape photographers often use the LCD screen on live view, so it doesn't matter. The Sony A7R IV has all if you are a landscape photographer. Now, last one thing I have to mention is that there are many landscape photographers like Thomas Heaton, Ben Horn, and other also photographers there are, and they actually shoot themselves while shooting landscape photography. So on that part, you can actually think that okay, I will go and buy the Sony Alpha 1 because Sony Alpha 1 can shoot 8K up to 30p, 4K, 120p, and that will be just great. For the Sony A7R IV can only shoot up to 4K 30p. So if I buy that particular camera, I can use that particular camera to make photographic tutorial also. But you have to understand that on terms of Thomas Heaton, he actually shoots landscape photography, set his everything, and the videographic contents actually shoot on another camera. So you have to buy a second camera, and I will say that buy the Sony A7R IV for your primary landscape photography camera, and you can buy the Sony Alpha 64000, which is a APS-C crop sensor camera, or even the Sony A7 Mark III, or if you have a little bit more money, then you can buy the Sony A7S Mark III for your videographic need. I think that will be a wiser decision if you want to make that kind of tutorial thing, landscape photography plus landscape videographic tutorial. But I will suggest you to stay away from the Sony Alpha 1. It is just great on paper but not in practical real life situation, and for that reason I actually said that the Sony Alpha 1, Canon EOS R1 and the Nikon Z9 are the emerging problem in mirrorless world, because they all sits at the same perspective of camera industry. They actually offers all on terms of videography, on terms of photography. They actually offers all. So if you see those three upline cameras, you can ask that no one actually needs other cameras like the Sony A7C, Sony A7 Mark III, Sony A7S lineup, Sony A7R lineup, in the Canon EOS R5, R6, Nikon Z5, Z6, Z7, Z7S, Z7 Mark II, Z6 Mark II. They are actually not having that much of a meaning after releasing these three particular camera, and I actually hate this marketing gimmick, I will say, because for me nothing can do all. In terms of human, if you are a male or female, you can be a lawyer, can be a photographer, can be a videographer, can be a dancer, can be a painter, but you can do great in at least one single way. You cannot be a great photographer, you cannot be a great cricketer at the same time. You have to understand that. So for me, no camera can do all. But if you see the Sony Alpha 1, Canon EOS R1, Nikon Z9, they actually can do all. Great videographic specification, great autofocus speed, great frames per second, great high megapixel count. So I am actually hating those particular three cameras. So as in conclusion, I'll say that go and buy the Sony A7R Mark IV and use the extra $2,500 to buy an extra lens, extra gear, filter, tripod, whatever you can buy with the extra money. So that's all guys I have to say here about these two particular cameras, and let me know in the comment section below that what would you pick, what will be your camera if you have the option to pick between those two perfect cameras, and let me know in the comment section below your reasons that why you are picking. And goodbye guys, have a nice day, see you in the next video.